Domesticating animals changed human health forever and not for the better. This is sciencealert.com. Human civilization as we know it would not exist were it not for farm animals. But neither, it seems, would many major illnesses in human history. For the first time, scientists have found direct evidence that the domestication and husbandry of livestock coincided with the rise of animal-borne diseases like the plague, Yersinia pestis, and louse-borne relapsing fever. Archaeologists have long suspected that as nomadic hunter-gatherers in Eurasia began to settle into large pastoral communities around 12,000 years ago, the risk of pathogens jumping from animals to humans would have increased. They didn't have hand sanitizer 12,000 years ago, unfortunately for them. Recent advances in ancient DNA analysis have finally allowed experts to put that hypothesis to the test. Sifting through 405 billion DNA sequences collecting from 1,313 ancient human remains across Eurasia, an international team of researchers led by geogeneticist Martin Sikora at the University of Copenhagen has identified numerous genes belonging to microbes. Their sweeping search for pathogen DNA provided sufficient detail for a 12,500-year-long timeline on the emergence and spread of major human diseases. This team's results are not yet peer-reviewed, but according to a preprint paper, a substantial fraction of these microbes came from external environmental sources, such as animals. While many microbes that infect humans remain steady throughout the sample period, zoonotic diseases, basically where pathogens spread to humans from animals or vice versa, were only detected from around 6,500 years ago. In fact, the bacterium that causes the plague, which also lives in small rodents and fleas, and the pathogen that causes LBRF, which lives in lice, were both undetectable in human remains until 6,000 years ago, a time that broadly coincides with the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies. Interesting. From that point on, zoonotic microbial DNA was consistently detected in the genomes of the ancient humans remains studied. The uptick in zoonotic disease is not solely the result of direct human-animal interactions. It could also stem from the fact that as human communities grew denser in population, hygiene decreased, and pests like rodents, fleas, lice, and ticks increased. Outbreaks of LBRF, for existence, are historically associated with poor living conditions and hygienes. Louse-borne relapsing fever is LBRF. Our results thus provide the first direct evidence for an epidemiological transition of increased zoonotic infectious disease and disease burden after the onset of agriculture through historical times. Today, zoonotic diseases make up more than 60% of newly emerging infectious diseases, and yet all those millennia ago, such microbes were a new experience for humans. Continuing on, early societies in the Eurasian steppes that were exposed to zoonotic pathogens prior to others might have had a big advantage. Not only did these pastoral communities have access to regular sources of meat and dairy, their bodies had time to adjust to new animal pathogens. Sikora and colleagues found a spike in the detection rates for zoonotic microbial DNA in human remains throughout Eurasia, occurring around 5,000 years ago. This suggests that when steppe pastoralis populations migrated to new regions around this time, bringing their knowledge of agriculture with them, they also brought their zoonotic diseases. It is possible that the steppe pastoralis, through their long-term continuous exposure to animals, might have developed some immunity to certain zoonoses, and their dispersals carried these diseases westwards and eastwards. Consequently, the genetic upheaval in Europe could have been facilitated by epidemic waves of zoonotic diseases sweeping through the continent. If this is true, many people in Europe likely died as a result of the human migration, mirroring what happened later to indigenous people elsewhere in the world during European colonization. Over time, as human communities in Eurasia grew denser, zoonotic pathogens took off, turning endemic outbreaks into epidemics. So, shit turned real bad. The bacterium responsible for the plague, which can live in horses, cattle, and sheep, caused its first epidemic in the Roman Empire about 540 CE. The recent genomic analysis also suggests why pestis was around at lower, relatively continuous levels from 5,700 years ago to about 2,700 years ago. By medieval times, the plague was just a mass killer. In 3 medieval cemeteries in Denmark, researchers found 11 out of 39 individuals suffered from the illness at their time of death. So this thing was going around. In comparison, LBRF peaked around 2,000 years ago when there was barely any detectable plague activity. Researchers suspect it spread as a result of increased crowding and poor hygiene, war, forced migrations, poverty, or famine. While more research needs to be done to understand why these outbreaks occurred, the team says their map provides robust evidence that a major shift in human lifestyle thousands of years ago ultimately led to an increase in zoonotic infectious diseases, which has profoundly impacted global human health and history throughout the millennia and continues today. Interesting. Now, this is the actual study in and of itself. Talking about the domestication of animals and how that came about, but you think about it. Let's go down here. I think this is a great example. You can kind of see, so particularly in this area, Northern Africa and in the Middle East and into Asia, it's kind of where if you think about maybe 10, 12, 15,000 years ago when there was a big uprising, or I guess increase of humans beginning to start to emerge, that they started to use things like, you can see these arrows, you can see the humped cow in South Asia that was 8,000 years ago. You can see the goat in the Middle East about 10,500 years ago. You can see the dog 15 to 36,000 years ago in Eurasia. You can see it in Northern Europe right there. That is where my dog is from, a golden retriever from Europe. Then you see sheep in the Middle East as well. That's 11,000 years ago. You see cows in the Middle East 10,300 years ago. Same thing for pigs, also in the Middle East. Horses 5,500 years ago. And then you kind of get younger with alpacas, chickens, turkeys, ducks. Continuing on now, the alpacas and the turkeys are in different continents. But if we're sticking to Asia and the Middle East, you're going to get horses about 5,500 years ago in Central Asia. You're going to get also chickens 4,000 years ago in East Asia. But now compare that to cows, or even the humped cow in South Asia, but cows in the Middle East, you can kind of see where this is pointing down to right there. Right there, that's where cows originated from 10,300 years ago. So 6,000 years prior to chickens, there were cows that were being used to, I don't know if they milked them or anything, but I would assume that they just use them for their meat, but also to help plow crops and do all the basic needs of agriculture. But I say that to say that these older species that you see, like goat, dog, sheep, cow, pig, even the humped cow, many of these, with the exception of, say, a dog, cats are also kind of old here, 9,500 years in the Middle East as well. But cat and dog are not being used for, unless probably required if there's low options available at the time, those are most likely not going to be used for their meat, as opposed to, say, a cow, which is where you can kill one cow and you can feed a family of 4 to 10 people for a year, just if you kill one cow. Whereas if you try and kill a dog or a cat, you're not going to get that much meat. So it made more sense. And also with the cows, you can basically train them to do the agriculture for you, where it's much easier to do that with a cow. And now we kind of see how over what 10,000 years, how we've transformed the cow into a almost a agricultural machine for us. Whereas in the beginning, I had imagined they just wanted to graze out in the fields. But as a result of humans and our civilization using them for those agricultural needs, it transformed the specifically Middle East and Eurasia portions, started to expand those agricultural regions. And unfortunately for them, that contributed to the increase in diseases. So you can kind of see right here a very good graphic and kind of give you an idea of how this kind of started. You see pigs here as well in the Middle East, very well known for the many diseases that they will carry. But imagine 10,300 years ago. Imagine those diseases that they had back then. Very, very good. Since the Neolithic period, humans struggled to domesticate wild animals and use them as food sources, milk and meat. Commodity manufacturers, silk and wool, protection, and transportation. So they struggled to domesticate them. There are 3 pathways described for domestication: commensal, prey, and direct pathways. In the commensal pathway, the wild animals were attracted to anthropogenic habitats, mainly for human food waste or small prey, establishing a commensal relationship with humans. Dog, cats, or chickens are some of the species that followed this pathway. So chickens are 4,000 years ago in East Asia. Dogs will be more so Europe. Cats will be Middle East, okay? So those are, and Joe Rogan's talked about this many times on his podcast about how many of the current dogs that we have, the dog breeds that we have, were originally wolves who people would start to give their food to, start to kind of adopt these animals. And over hundreds and thousands of years, these animals were bred to be more friendlier to humans, so less wolf-like, less aggressive. Through selective breeding, they were chosen to have dogs that now today you have a golden retriever, who is a dog that, I mean, if you have a person breaking into our house, she's not going to attack him. She's not going to really protect us all that much. She's going to love and want to get pet and that kind of stuff. But you imagine 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, her ancestor would have mauled the person who tried to come into, at that point in time, our little village. So over the course of time, these animals were bred and conditioned to be a much more friendly pet. And that goes for chickens and for commensals, this dog, cats, or chickens. Moving on, in the prey pathway, humans start hunting some species like pigs and cattle for their meat in response to the depletion of the local stocks of these animals. Over time, these game management strategies developed into controlled breeding of these species. And now you see another thing Joe Rogan talks about is the pig population in South Texas, where it's gotten completely and utterly out of control because of the reproduction capabilities of pigs. So if you're going to have a wide open space with cows and pigs, which both have a very large amount of meat on them, particularly with cows because they're so much bigger, it would make sense to try and have a large grouping of them and then try and harvest their meats. In the direct pathway, humans controlled wild animals such as horses, donkeys, and camelids, or camels, to obtain some resources by controlling their movements. Their nutrition and reproduction would lead to a dramatic bottleneck. And let's go in here to look at camels. Central Asia, not what many people would associate with maybe the Middle East or Northeastern Africa, possibly for camels. No, Asia, Central Asia, 4,500 years ago. And then you can kind of, I mean, it's not as important, but some of these other ones like turkeys in North America, llamas and alpacas in South America. But the majority of the stuff that we're going to care about is going to be the dog-cat relationship, and because those are some of the two oldest ones, particularly with dogs being the oldest on this list, followed by the cow, the sheep, the goat, all that stuff in the Middle East. And you can see right here now, this has great, now looking at this, it makes sense for a lot of the early religions that started out of the Middle East as well, with some being very favorable towards cows and wanting to protect cows as well, because it has been a part of our civilization for so long. And they have been an important reason for why we have progressed. But in the study, talks about how some of these things, and this is, I really do suggest you to go and read this. This is fascinating to dive into each different thing right here. I think it's extremely important to do so, especially the dogs, because you see the difference between a German Shepherd, a Golden Retriever, a German Dachshund, however you say it, but like a poodle, a golden poodle, like all these different dog breeds started from a similar family tree. And over the course of time, because of humans, they have gone into different pathways and different sizes, different attitudes, and so on and so forth. So definitely encourage you to go and read this. I mean, very, very interesting. And then this is the ancient Yersinia pestis genomes from across Western Europe reveal early diversification from the first pandemic. So this is talking about the in the article of Science Alert, they mentioned the early pandemic, which was caused by Yersinia pestis, which is from animals, so cows and that kind of from the source. So let's just read the abstract. We'll read this all, actually. Not all of this, but we'll read the abstract and the significance. So the significance first. The first historically reported pandemic attributed to Yersinia pestis started with the Justinianic plague 541 to 544 and continued for around 2,000 years as the so-called first pandemic. To date, only one Y pestis strain from this pandemic has been reconstructed using ancient DNA. In this study, we present 8 genomes from Britain, France, Germany, and Spain, demonstrating the geographic range of the plague during the first pandemic and showing microdiversity in the early medieval period. Moreover, we detect similar genome decay during the first and second pandemics, the 14th to 18th century, that includes the 2 virulence factors, thus providing an example of potential convergent evolution of Y pestis during large-scale epidemics. So it could have evolved and gotten a little bit more deadly. Now, for the abstract. The first historically documented pandemic caused by Yersinia pestis began as the Justinianic plague in 541 within the Roman Empire and continued as the so-called first pandemic until 750. Although paleogenomic studies have previously identified the causative agent as Y. pestis, little is known about the bacterium's spread, diversity, and genetic history over the course of the pandemic. To elucidate the microevolution of the bacterium during this time period, we screened human remains from 21 sites in Austria, Britain, Germany, France, and Spain for Y. pestis DNA and reconstructed 8 genomes. We present a methodological approach assessing each nucleotide polymorphisms in ancient bacterial genomes, facilitating qualitative analysis of low-coverage genomes in a metagenomic background. And now we're starting to get into the weeds of stuff that I don't know. Let's see. What does this mean? Let's see what this means. Let's look this up. Phylogenetics. Phylogenetics is a study of the evolutionary history and relationships among or within groups of organisms. Okay. Phylogenetic analysis on the 8 reconstructed genomes reveal the existence of previously undocumented Y. pestis diversity during the 6th to 8th centuries and provides evidence for the presence of multiple distinct Y. pestis strains in Europe, where you see a lot of dogs. We offer genetic evidence for the presence of the Justinianic plague in the British Isles, previously only hypothesized from ambiguous documentary accounts, as well as the parallel occurrence in multiple derived strains in central and southern France, Spain, and southern Germany. 4 of the reported strains form a polytomy. Let's look this one up as well. An internal node of a phylogenetic tree is described as a polytomy or multifurcation if it is rooted in a tree and is linked to the theorem. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Similar to others seen across the Y. pestis phylogeny, or maybe, associated with the second and third pandemics. Very interesting, very interesting. I'll also drop this in there as well. This is just talking about one particular plague, basically the first plague. So here's another study talking about basically the same exact thing, the landscape of ancient human pathogens in Eurasia from the Stone Age to historical times. And here is the summary. You can have the full text here, all this stuff right here, even a PDF version, but very, very interesting. So I want to go back to this image right here because I think this is one of the more important things to look at. The idea is that during the early parts of when humans were becoming hunter-gatherers and starting to get into the agricultural space, so they started to learn how to plant their own food, how to be more self-sufficient as opposed to having to move around a particular location or a particular area to go after food. Whereas with agriculture, they can grow their own food, they can have their own livestock, and they can basically be a little bit more self-sufficient. There will be some things that you'll need to go and gather that you will not be able to create using agriculture. But in terms of food and some supplies and some basic functions, agriculture and having some of these things such as cows or dogs can be beneficial to these early civilizations. And you see here in the Middle East and in Asia that particularly with the rise in use of things such as cows or pigs or chickens and stuff that early humans used for not only agricultural purposes, but also for food purposes, could have potentially had a devastating impact because there was no way to protect against any disease that any of these animals had. And if you had, say, one cow who was sick with the particular disease that was described, and you harvest it, you kill it, and you give it to multiple families, the meat to multiple families. Now multiple families are eating that meat, and they don't have a air fryer. They're cooking mostly over open fire, maybe wood fires, wood stoves, and stuff like that. But it's not super complex, and they're not cooking it exactly to 165, like to kill all the bacteria and all the germs and stuff that are within it. They don't know about that point in time, from what we know. By doing so, and by not cooking it thoroughly, by having this meat that is tainted and eating it, you could potentially have the beginning of these pandemics. Very interesting. Very interesting. This one is one of the more interesting ones because it goes on later. I mean, this thing is a massive thing. You see conclusion. Let's see conflicts of interest. All right, no conflicts of interest. That was good. That's good. But yeah, read the conclusion, challenges and prospects. I mean, very, very interesting stuff here.